Steve Harvey had seen a lot in his years hosting Family Feud. He had seen grown men burst into tears over wrong answers. He had seen families argue on live television. He had seen contestants win big money and collapse in shock. He thought he had seen everything. He had not seen this. On a Tuesday afternoon in April 2024, a 92-year-old man in a faded veteran's cap walked slowly across the Family Feud stage and took his seat at the end of the family line. The audience clapped the way audiences clap for elderly people on television, warmly, respectfully, with a kind of gentle admiration. But nobody in that room yet understood what was about to happen. Nobody understood that the man sitting quietly at the end of that row was about to ask a question that had been sitting in his chest for 73 years, without meaning to ask it at all. His name was Harold Mason. Everyone called him Hal. He was a Korean War veteran, a widower, a father, and a grandfather. And somewhere out in the world, he had always believed there might be a daughter he had never once met. What happened that afternoon in that studio would bring the entire audience to its feet. It would leave Steve Harvey unable to speak for almost 2 minutes. And it would prove something that every person in that room would carry with them for the rest of their lives. That it is never too late to come home. Harold Mason was born in 1932 in a small farming town in rural Ohio called Millbrook. He was the second of 4 children. His father fixed tractors and his mother taught Sunday school. Life in Millbrook was simple and honest. People worked hard, said grace before meals, and looked out for each other without being asked. Hal grew up learning that a man's word was everything, that family came first, and that you didn't walk away from something just because it got hard. At 18 years old, Hal enlisted in the United States Army. The year was 1950. The Korean War had just begun. Like thousands of young men across America, Hal signed up without hesitation. His mother cried at the kitchen table. His father shook his hand and said, "Make us proud, son." Those were the last words his father ever said to him face to face. But before he shipped out, something happened that Hal would spend the rest of his life thinking about. Her name was Margaret Hollis. She was 20 years old, the daughter of a local schoolteacher, with dark brown eyes and a laugh that Hal always said could make a whole room feel warmer just by existing. They had known each other since high school, but it was in those final weeks before deployment that something real grew between them. They spent every available evening together, walking along the creek behind the Hollis property, talking about the future, making the quiet promises that young people make when they don't yet know how hard life can be. 3 days before Hal shipped out to Korea, he asked Margaret to wait for him. She said yes. He kissed her goodbye on her mother's porch, picked up his duffel bag, turned once to wave, and then he was gone. In Korea, Hal served 14 months in the infantry. He saw things he would never speak about to anyone, not his children, not his grandchildren, not even his closest friends. He came home in 1952 a quieter man than the one who had left. But he came home with one thing still burning in his chest. He needed to find Margaret. He went to the Hollis house first. The porch was empty. A neighbor told him Margaret had moved away about 8 months after Hal had shipped out. She had gone to live with an aunt somewhere in Pennsylvania. No one in Millbrook knew much more than that. Hal wrote letters. He tracked down old classmates. He drove to neighboring towns and contacted Margaret's former school. But Margaret had completely disappeared into a life he couldn't find. What Hal did not know, what no one in Millbrook knew, was the reason she had left. Margaret Hollis had discovered she was pregnant 2 weeks after Hal shipped out, before his first letter even arrived. Scared, alone, and unmarried in 1950s rural Ohio, she had done what many women of that era felt they had no choice but to do. She left quietly and started over somewhere else. She gave birth to a baby girl in the fall of 1951. She named her Dorothy. and she told Dorothy, from the time she was old enough to ask questions, that her father had been a soldier who died in the war. A good man. A hero. Gone before he ever knew she existed. Hal spent 3 years searching before he finally accepted that Margaret was out of his reach. He moved to Columbus, found work in manufacturing, and built a quiet, decent life for himself. In 1958, he married a woman named Ruth. They had one son, Robert, in 1961. Ruth passed away in 2009 after 51 years of marriage. Hal described their life together as good and kind and real. But there was always a part of him that wondered. He never stopped wondering. Every Veterans Day, when someone thanked him for his service, Hal would smile and talk about Ohio and Robert and his grandchildren. But somewhere in the middle of all that, his eyes would go somewhere far away, toward a question that had never been answered. Did Margaret have his child? He never said it out loud. Not to Ruth. Not to Robert. He kept it tucked away like a photograph worn soft at the edges, never thrown away. Robert Mason was 62 years old, a retired high school principal from Dayton, Ohio. He had applied to be on Family Feud 3 times over the years, mostly as something fun to do with the family. In early 2024, the call finally came. The producers wanted the Mason family, 4 generations, with Hal as the patriarch. When Robert told his father about the show, Hal's first reaction was no. He was 92 years old. He didn't need to be on television. His knees were bad and the studio would probably be too cold. But his granddaughter Emily, who was 28 and had grown up watching Family Feud with Hal every single evening, sat down next to him on the couch, took his hand, and said quietly, "Grandpa Hal, please, do it for me." Hal Mason, who had survived a war and outlived nearly everyone he had ever known, was completely helpless against his granddaughter's eyes. He said yes. What Robert had not told his father, what he had been quietly sitting with for 3 weeks, was something he had found while doing research to prepare the family for the show. He had come across an obituary. Margaret Hollis, aged 91, had passed away in Pittsburgh in 2014, and listed among her surviving family was one daughter, Dorothy Ellen Hollis Graham of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, age 72. Robert had stared at that name for a very long time. Then he had done something he never expected to do. He reached out to the Family Feud production team and told them everything. What his father had told him years ago about a woman named Margaret. The letters that never got replies. The searching that went nowhere. And the possibility, never confirmed and never fully ruled out, that his father had a daughter somewhere in the world who had grown up without him. The producers took the story seriously. They quietly reached out to Dorothy Hollis Graham and told her what they knew. Dorothy, now 73 years old, went very quiet on the phone. Then she said 2 words, "I know." Dorothy had discovered the truth 10 years earlier, the week after her mother's funeral, while cleaning out Margaret's home in Pittsburgh. In a shoebox in the back of a bedroom closet she found over 40 letters. Love letters, written in a careful young man's handwriting from a boy named Harold Mason of Millbrook, Ohio. The last letter was dated October 1951. Every single one of them was unopened. Margaret had received them, kept every one, and never opened a single letter after the first. Dorothy had read every letter in one night, sitting on her mother's bedroom floor, surrounded by 70-year-old envelopes. She had wept for hours, not just for herself, but for the father she had been raised to believe was dead. For the young man who had loved her mother and gone to war and come back searching for someone who had disappeared. For the 70 years of distance between 2 people who had never been given a single chance. After that night, Dorothy had tried to find Harold Mason, but without resources and with a trail that was over 6 decades cold, she hit dead end after dead end. She hired a private investigator for a few months, but the cost became too great. She had eventually allowed herself to believe that Harold was probably gone, that her chance had passed. When the Family Feud production team called and told her that Harold Mason, age 92, Korean War veteran, originally of Millbrook, Ohio, was about to tape an episode of their show in Los Angeles, Dorothy had pressed her hand over her mouth and could not speak for a full minute. She asked only one question. "Is he healthy?" They told her yes. 92 and sharp as a tack. She bought a plane ticket that same afternoon. On the day of the taping, Dorothy Hollis Graham sat in the studio audience in the third row from the front. She wore a blue blouse. Her hair was silver white. Her hands were trembling slightly in her lap. She was holding her purse tightly against her side, and inside that purse was one of Harold's old letters, the very first one. Unopened for 73 years, until she had opened it on her mother's bedroom floor. She did not know exactly what she was going to do with it. She just needed it close. She had not told her children she was coming. She had not told anyone. She had flown to Los Angeles completely alone and sat in that audience to wait for a man she had never met who might be her father. The production team had agreed not to tell Hal anything in advance. Whatever happened in that room would be completely real. The Mason family played a strong game that afternoon. Hal sat at the end of the family line and watched his grandchildren compete with the kind of quiet, unhurried pride that only someone who has lived long enough to understand what really matters can manage. He clapped when they got the right answers. He shook his head and smiled when they got them wrong. He was, by the account of every production staff member who was there that day, the most dignified person they had ever seen on that stage. When the Mason family won the main game and moved on to Fast Money, the audience erupted. Not just because they had played well, but because watching a 92-year-old veteran cheer for his grandchildren under studio lights was simply one of the most moving things anyone in that room had seen in years. During the break before Fast Money, Steve Harvey walked to the end of the family line and crouched down slightly to be at eye level with Hal. "Mr. Mason," Steve said, his voice easy and warm. "I have to ask you something. You've been sitting over here the whole game like you're the CEO of the universe, 92 years old, and you look like a man who has figured everything out. What's your secret?" Hal laughed. It came from deep in the chest, slow and soft, the laugh of someone who had earned it. "I don't know about all that," he said. "I just know what matters." "And what's that?" Steve asked. Hal was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the audience, a full studio of strangers who had come to watch a game show on a Tuesday afternoon. Then he looked back at Steve. "Family," he said. "The people who show up, the ones who stay." He paused. He rubbed his wedding ring once with his thumb, the ring he had worn since 1958 and had never taken off, "and the ones you never got to have." Steve tilted his head. The audience had gone quiet without deciding to. "What do you mean by that last part?" Steve asked gently. Hal looked down at his hands. Then he looked back up, and something in his face had changed. Not sadness exactly, more like the look of a man who has been keeping a room locked for a very long time and has finally decided it costs too much to keep it locked. "I had a girl," Hal said, "before the war, before all of it. Her name was Margaret." He said the name carefully, the way you say the name of someone you have been carrying for a long, long time. "I went to Korea. Came back. She was gone. I looked for years. I never found her." He let out a slow breath. "I always wondered if there might have been a child. A daughter somewhere. Someone who grew up not knowing me." He shook his head slightly. 92 years old and I still think about it. Some things don't let go of a person. The entire studio was completely still. Steve Harvey stood up slowly. He held his index cards in his hand, but he didn't look at them. He didn't need to. Before the taping started, a producer had pulled him aside and told him exactly what to look for. Which row? Which seat? What she was wearing. Steve looked out at the audience. His eyes moved slowly across the rows, and then he stopped. Third row. Blue blouse. Silver white hair. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her chin trembling, her eyes already full of tears that had not yet fallen. Steve raised his hand and pointed. Not with any drama, not for effect, just the simple, direct gesture of a man pointing at something that needs to be seen. "Sir," Steve said, his voice barely above a regular speaking tone, "I need you to look right there." Hal turned toward the audience. His eyes followed the direction of Steve's hand. He found the woman in the third row. For a moment, nothing in that entire studio moved. Then the woman stood up. Steve spoke quietly into his microphone. "Mr. Mason, her name is Dorothy. Dorothy Hollis Graham. She flew here from Philadelphia because she has been looking for you for a very long time." Hal stared at the woman standing in the third row. He was 92 years old. He had survived a war in Korea. He had buried his wife. He had watched the entire world change around him for nearly a century. And he was not, by any measure, a man who cried easily. But Harold Mason put both of his hands over his face and wept. The audience was on its feet before anyone made a conscious decision to stand. People were crying without fully understanding why. The way people cry at moments of pure human truth when the heart understands something before the mind can catch up. Dorothy stepped out of her row and walked toward the stage. A production assistant met her at the steps. She climbed up slowly, because her legs were not entirely steady and because she wanted to see him clearly before she reached him. She wanted to take it in. By the time she arrived in front of him, Hal had lowered his hands. He was looking up at her from his seat, his eyes still wet, his face completely open. He looked at her the way people look at a photograph they have been picturing for years, checking the details, making sure it is real. "You look like her," Hal said. His voice came out in barely a whisper. "You've got her eyes." Dorothy's face broke apart. She said one word. Dad, and Harold Mason reached up and took his daughter's hand. Steve Harvey had interviewed thousands of people in his career. He had made people laugh, surprised them, moved them, caught them completely off guard. But he stood at the side of that stage and did not say a single word for almost 2 full minutes. Because there was nothing that needed saying. What was happening in front of him was complete on its own. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough in a way that people who knew him said they had never heard before. 73 years, Steve said. 73 years this man has been wondering. And she's been wondering too. And today, on a Tuesday afternoon in a television studio, they found each other. He shook his head slowly. "I don't care what it takes. I would do this show for free for the rest of my life if every day had a moment like this one." Dorothy reached into her purse. She took out the letter. The first one Harold had ever written to Margaret, 73 years old, never opened until Dorothy opened it alone on her mother's bedroom floor. She held it in both hands and offered it to him. "Your letter," she said softly. "Mama never opened it. But I did. And I want you to know, what you wrote, it was beautiful. You were a good man even then. You were always a good man." Hal took the letter with hands that were shaking slightly. He looked at his own handwriting from 1951. A young man's handwriting. Careful and full of hope. He pressed it once against his chest and closed his eyes. "Thank you," he said. It was the only thing he could find. The Mason family had won $22,000 in fast money that afternoon. Nobody in the building could tell you exactly when that happened. The win had gotten completely lost in the middle of everything else that mattered far more. After the taping, the production team arranged for Hal and Dorothy to have time alone before anyone else came in. They sat in a quiet room with 2 chairs facing each other and 2 cups of coffee on the table between them, and they talked for almost 3 hours. Dorothy told him everything. Growing up believing her father had died in the war, the shoebox in her mother's closet, reading all 40 letters in one night on the bedroom floor, the years of searching and the dead ends, the moment she finally allowed herself to believe it was too late. Hal told her about Korea, about the years of searching for Margaret, about building a life in Columbus, the son he raised, the wife he loved for 51 years. He told her that he had never spoken all of this out loud to another living person, not fully, not all at once, until that afternoon when Steve Harvey crouched beside his chair and asked him what mattered. "I didn't plan to say any of it," Hal said, looking genuinely surprised at himself. "I'm 92 years old. I don't usually go around telling strangers my business." He looked at Dorothy. "But I looked out at all those people and thought, what's the point of holding on to it anymore? What does keeping it to myself do for anybody?" Dorothy smiled at him. "It got you here," she said. Hal laughed. "I suppose it did." That evening, Dorothy introduced Hal to her 3 adult children over a video call from her hotel room. Her son James, 48, her daughters Patricia and Carol, 45 and 42. They were all crying before the call was 10 seconds old. James told Hal that his whole life he had been told his grandfather died in the war and had grown up proud of a man whose name he never knew. Hal told him the name now. "Harold James Mason," Hal said. "That's me." James went quiet on the video screen. Then he said carefully, "You just said my name." Hal looked confused. "What do you mean?" "Harold James. My name is James." Dorothy had covered her mouth with both hands. Neither of them had ever made that connection before. Not in 48 years. Nobody spoke for a full minute. Then everybody spoke at the same time. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, the response was immediate and massive. The clip of Steve Harvey pointing toward the audience went viral within hours. By the end of the first day, it had been watched more than 40 million times on every platform. But the comments people left were not about Family Feud. They were about their own fathers, their own mothers, the people they had lost, and the ones they had never found. Hal Mason's 73-year-old question had somehow touched every unfinished thing in the lives of millions of strangers. Steve Harvey addressed it publicly with a statement that was itself shared millions of times. He wrote, "I have been on television my entire adult life. I have never been part of something more important than what happened in that studio on that Tuesday. That man served his country, came home, and spent 70 years quietly wondering about a daughter he never met. And she spent 70 years wondering about him. That is the real score. Not the money. Not the record books. That right there." Hal and Dorothy met in person 3 more times over the following year. Once in Philadelphia, where Dorothy took him to a restaurant her mother had loved. Once in Dayton, where Robert hosted a family dinner that lasted 6 hours and included 4 generations of the Mason family around the same table for the very first time. And once, quietly, at the cemetery in Pittsburgh where Margaret Hollis was buried. That visit was not filmed. It was not shared. It was just Hal and Dorothy and a winter morning and a simple headstone. Hal stood there for a long time. He had brought a single yellow flower because Robert had mentioned yellow was Margaret's favorite color, and Dorothy had confirmed it. He placed it gently against the stone. Then he said what he had never been able to say, all of it, quietly, in his own words. None of it was recorded. Dorothy stood slightly behind him and looked away to give him privacy, the way a daughter does for her father. When he turned around, he straightened up, squared his shoulders the way a soldier does, and said, "All right, let's go get some breakfast. I'm absolutely starving." Dorothy laughed so hard she almost cried again. "You are exactly what I hoped you would be," she said. What's that? Hal asked. Real, she said. Just completely real. 2 months later, Hal stood at a podium at a Veterans Day ceremony in Dayton. He was 92 years old and he spoke without notes. He talked about service and sacrifice, and Ruth and Robert and his grandchildren. And then he talked about Dorothy. He told the crowd that he had spent a long time believing the war had taken more from him than it gave, that it had cost him something he could never get back. But I was wrong, he said. Turns out I just had to wait a little longer than most people. About 73 years longer. A few people in the crowd laughed through their tears. Hal looked out at them and said, "Don't give up on the things you've lost. Some of them are still out there. You just have to live long enough to get there." Dorothy was sitting in the front row. She stood up and clapped. Everyone else stood up too. Hal squinted at her from the podium, and then he pointed, the same quiet, certain way Steve Harvey had pointed in that television studio, and said into the microphone, "There's my daughter. Right there. That's my girl." He said it the way a man says something he has waited a very long time to say, with complete certainty, with absolute peace. The story of Harold Mason and Dorothy Hollis Graham became one of the most shared human interest stories of 2024. News outlets covered it. Documentary filmmakers called. A book proposal was submitted on their behalf. Both Hal and Dorothy declined most of it. They were busy with something more important. They had 73 years to catch up on, and neither of them wanted to waste another minute.